Have you ever met someone at the exact moment you felt most broken? And somehow they saw the parts of you no one else could. On her wedding day, Madison Clark lost everything she thought she could count on. That same night, Ethan Cole, a man with success most people only dream of, was quietly drowning in loneliness. Two strangers, each carrying a private storm, found themselves in the same quiet corner of a Charleston jazz bar. One conversation, one moment of understanding, and the beginning of something neither of them expected. If you were in their place, would you risk trusting someone new, even when your heart was still in pieces? This is a story about loss, hope, and the kind of love that doesn't just find you, it saves you. If you find this story touching, comment 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Now, let's begin Madison and Ethan's journey. Charleston's late afternoon light spilled over the harbor, painting the water in shades of gold and rose. From the balcony of the bridal suite at the Harborview Hotel, Madison Clark stood in her ivory gown, hands resting on the cool wrought iron railing. The scent of salt water drifted up from the marina, mixing with the faint perfume from her bouquet of gardenias resting inside. It should have been the happiest day of her life. Below, along the boardwalk, guests were beginning to gather for the ceremony. Laughter floated up, muffled by the wind. Somewhere down there, Ryan Miller, the man she had loved for 5 years, was shaking hands, greeting family, promising forever. Madison's heart ought to have been racing with anticipation. Instead, there was a strange, hollow ache in her chest, a quiet she couldn't quite explain. The quiet was shattered by the soft buzz of her phone on the vanity table behind her. She turned, lifting the hem of her dress carefully so it wouldn't snag. The name on the screen was unfamiliar. A single video message. She pressed play, the screen flaring in the dim room. The image was shaky, caught on a phone camera, but there was no mistaking the dark sweep of Ryan's hair, the way his hand curled around the back of a woman's neck, drawing her in. The woman's red dress flashed in the sun as they kissed deeply, intimately on the deck of the rented yacht. The very yacht moored just beyond the hotel pier. The timestamp read 45 minutes ago. The air left Madison's lungs in one jagged exhale. Her knees wavered beneath the heavy silk of her gown. For a moment, the world tilted. The sound of the ocean roared in her ears, and the taste of salt on her lips was no longer the sea breeze, but tears. She set the phone down as though it had burned her. Her reflection in the full-length mirror showed a woman she barely recognized, wide eyes, trembling hands, the careful sweep of makeup beginning to blur at the corners. She thought of the mornings Ryan had kissed her forehead before work, the way he had promised. "I can't wait to see you walk down that aisle." And now she saw his mouth on someone else's. A knock came at the door, followed by her friend Sophie Bennett's voice, light but strained. "Mad, they're asking if you're ready for photos." Madison swallowed hard, her throat raw. "Just give me a minute." She turned back to the balcony. The gulls wheeled lazily above the water, oblivious. Down below, the yacht bobbed gently against its ropes, white against the blue-green tide. She could almost see them, Ryan and that woman, their bodies close, in a way he hadn't touched her in months. Her fingers found the zipper at the back of her dress, but it snagged halfway. She yanked again, the lace biting into her skin. Panic clawed at her chest. She couldn't stay here, couldn't smile for photographs, couldn't pretend that everything was still whole. In one sharp breath, she kicked off her heels, the beaded straps clattering against the hardwood. The cool floor met her bare feet as she gathered the skirt in both hands and bolted for the door. The hallway was empty, the air-conditioned chill a stark contrast to the heat pressing in from outside. She hurried past framed paintings of Charleston's cobblestone streets, down the service stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. Out through the side exit, she stepped into the sting of the evening breeze. The sand at Folly Beach was still warm beneath her feet, fine grains slipping between her toes as she walked faster. Then ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that each step took her farther from the vows she could no longer speak. The hem of her dress dragged through the tide line, the salt water darkening the silk. Somewhere behind her, voices called her name. Sophie's voice, then her mother's, sharper, worried. Madison didn't stop. She reached the far end of the beach, where the pier cast a long shadow over the water. Leaning against one of the weathered posts, she caught her breath, her chest rising and falling hard. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sudden, gut-deep realization that she'd ignored the signs the late nights at the restaurant, the evasive answers, the way Ryan had stopped asking about her photography projects. Maybe, she thought bitterly, this day had been doomed long before the dress, the flowers, the menu tastings. Her phone buzzed again, another call from Sophie. Madison stared at the screen until it went dark, then slipped it into the pocket she'd sewn into the lining of her gown. She wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. Above the rush of the waves, a single thought settled in her mind, heavy and cold. There's no going back. Somewhere deep inside, under the hurt. A quieter truth flickered, one she couldn't name yet. She had no idea that this single decision to walk away would change everything in ways she couldn't imagine. And it would begin that very night. The street lamps along East Bay Street flickered to life as twilight sank over Charleston. Madison kept walking, the hem of her gown torn and wet, clinging to her legs with each step. People turned to look, a barefoot bride in a city that loved its gossip, but she kept her eyes on the uneven bricks beneath her feet. The sound of music drifted through the humid air, a slow, sultry saxophone line weaving around the hum of conversation. The glow spilled from the open door of a place she'd passed 100 times but never entered, Harborview Jazz Bar. She hesitated. Going inside meant stopping. Stopping meant feeling, and she wasn't sure she could handle the weight pressing against her ribs. Still, the thought of another block with her thoughts clawing at her made her step over the threshold. The room was warm, the kind of warm that wrapped around you like a quilt. Low amber lights reflected off the polished mahogany bar. A faint scent of old wood, bourbon, and something sweet, maybe vanilla, from the candles flickering on each table mingled in the air. Conversations dipped as a few patrons noticed her, then rose again. Quieter now. She slipped into a corner booth, tucking her skirt beneath her, trying to make herself small. The bartender, a man in his late 50s with a kind face, approached. Rough night. His voice was gentle, without judgment. Madison managed a weak smile. "You could say that." "Whiskey, okay?" he asked, already reaching for a glass. "Neat," she said, surprising herself. She rarely drank anything stronger than wine. The first sip burned, but the warmth that followed was welcome. She let her eyes wander to the small stage in the corner, where a trio played piano, bass, and saxophone. The music was slow and low, the kind that carried both sadness and comfort in equal measure. That's when she saw him. He was seated alone at the far end of the bar, his posture relaxed but his gaze distant, fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. Dark hair, just a little unruly. A crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. There was something about the set of his jaw, the stillness in his expression, that felt familiar. Not in the way you recognize a face, but in the way you recognize a feeling. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before he looked away, signaling the bartender. A few minutes later, he was walking toward her booth. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was low, steady, but not without warmth. She hesitated, then gestured to the seat across from her. "Sometimes," he said as he settled in, "it's easier to talk to a stranger than to people who know you." Madison gave a quiet laugh that wasn't really laughter. "What makes you think I want to talk?" He studied her for a moment. "You've got that look. The one that says you're carrying something heavy, and you're not sure you can make it to the next mile without setting it down." Something in her chest shifted. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe the music, maybe just the way his words found her without her having to explain. They spoke in fits and starts at first about music, about Charleston, about the strange comfort of being somewhere dim and unremarkable when your world is falling apart. Hours blurred. Madison found herself saying things she hadn't planned to say out loud. How she'd ignored the small signs with Ryan. How she'd convinced herself that love was supposed to feel like compromise, even when it felt more like surrender. He listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady on hers. And when he spoke, it wasn't with advice or pity, just simple truths from his own life. The loneliness of success. The way people wanted things from you instead of wanting you. By the time her third whiskey was gone, the heaviness in her chest had shifted into something else still raw, but lighter, as though a knot had loosened. A quiet moment stretched between them. Then, without thinking, Madison leaned across the table and kissed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't gentle. It was the kind of kiss born from exhaustion and need an anchor thrown into a storm. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then his hand came up, resting lightly against her cheek, and the kiss deepened, warm and steady. When they pulled apart, the space between them felt different, charged. Madison blinked, the reality of what she'd done sinking in. I should go." He didn't stop her. "Take care of yourself," was all he said, his voice quiet. She slid out of the booth, her skirt catching briefly on the edge of the table, then walked toward the door without looking back. The night air was cooler now, the city quieter. She had no way of knowing that this wouldn't be the last time she saw him, and that, the next time, everything would be different. Morning sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of Madison's apartment, far too bright for the way her head felt. She lay still, eyes closed, hoping if she didn't move, the ache behind her temples would fade, but the silence was deceptive. Her phone, on the nightstand, began to buzz, a relentless tremor that made her stomach twist. She reached for it, squinting at the screen. 42 missed calls, 20 from her mother, 15 from Sophie. The rest from numbers she didn't recognize. Beneath them, a string of unread text messages. "Where are you? People are talking. Ryan is telling everyone you got cold feet." Madison set the phone face down, the weight of it heavy in her palm. She didn't have the energy to defend herself, not today. Her small apartment felt both like a refuge and a cell. The pale blue walls were lined with framed photographs she'd taken over the years, shrimp boats at dawn, the rainbow row of houses along East Bay, the marsh grass glowing gold in late summer. Images of a life she'd built with care. Now they felt like windows to a world she wasn't sure she belonged to anymore. She made her way to the kitchen, bare feet brushing against the worn rug, and poured a glass of water. Her hand shook slightly as she set it down. The taste of last night's whiskey still clung to her tongue. It wasn't just the hangover, it was the realization that she'd crossed some invisible threshold. She couldn't go back to the Madison who believed in the version of Ryan she had loved. She couldn't unsee that kiss. She couldn't unknow the truth. A soft knock came at the door. Sophie's voice filtered through, quiet but steady. "It's me. I brought coffee." Madison hesitated, then unlocked the door. Sophie stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups and a small paper bag. "Blueberry muffins," she said, offering a half smile. "Thought you could use something that didn't come from a bottle." They sat at the small table by the window. Madison picked at the muffin, breaking it into pieces she didn't eat. Sophie filled the silence, telling her about a music class she'd taught the day before, the way one of the students had insisted on playing Amazing Grace 3 times in a row. "Finally," Sophie said. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I'm here. For whatever you need." Madison's throat tightened. "I don't even know what I need." Sophie reached across the table, covering Madison's hand with her own. "Then we figure it out one day at a time." Later that afternoon, Madison opened her email, hoping to distract herself with work. Instead, she found a message from the gallery that had been her biggest client. "Due to recent events, we'll be postponing our collaboration indefinitely." Her stomach sank. She knew what recent events meant. In a city like Charleston, word traveled faster than the tide. Vendors, clients, acquaintances, they would all have their own version of what happened. By evening, she sat at her desk surrounded by unopened envelopes, bills, wedding vendor receipts, refund denials. The cost of the catering alone could have covered 3 months' rent. She closed her eyes and let the numbers blur. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Outside, someone's wind chimes caught the breeze, their soft notes weaving through the air. Madison thought of the man at the bar, Ethan, and the strange, fleeting sense of safety she'd felt in his presence. She didn't even know his last name. The thought should have faded, but it lingered, unwelcome and persistent. She told herself it was just because he'd been kind when she needed kindness. Still, the memory of his steady gaze had a way of cutting through the fog. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her back. This time, it was Sophie. Found a job posting. Might be a distraction. Sending it now. Madison almost ignored it, but curiosity won. She opened the link, scanning the details. Personal assistant to CEO. Confidential. The salary was more than she'd ever made. Requirements, discretion, organizational skills, flexibility. She leaned back in her chair, the glow of the screen painting her face in the dim room. It was almost laughable she'd spent her adult life chasing light through a camera lens, not chasing the demands of an executive. But her savings account balance, displayed in the corner of her banking app, was a sobering reminder she couldn't afford to be picky. She saved the listing, telling herself she'd think about it tomorrow, but tomorrow had a way of arriving faster than you expect. The cursor blinked at the top of the job listing, each flash a silent dare. Madison sat back in her chair, arms crossed, as if putting a little distance between herself and the absurdity glowing on the screen. Personal assistant to CEO, confidential, salary generous, requirements, discretion, adaptability, organizational excellence. It was the sort of position she'd always imagined belonged to someone else's life, someone who wore tailored blazers, carried a leather-bound planner, and never had sand in their shoes from walking the beach barefoot. Her reflection in the laptop screen told another story, a woman in an old cotton t-shirt, hair tied in a knot that had given up halfway, with eyes that hadn't quite recovered from the night before. The practical voice in her head was quick to remind her that the rent was due in 3 weeks, that the deposit for the canceled wedding venue wasn't coming back, that her bank account balance, sitting just over $400, would vanish after one more trip to the grocery store and a utility bill. She closed the laptop and pushed it away, as if that could also push away the thought. An hour later, the laptop was back open. She read the posting again, slower this time, noting the words flexible hours and confidential projects. She had no idea what confidential meant in the world of CEOs, but she knew what it meant in her own life. No one needed to know how close she was to losing everything. Sophie's text popped up on her phone. "Did you see it? You'd be amazing." Madison smirked. "At being a corporate secretary, at being someone's anchor," Sophie replied. "Not everyone can do that." She stared at those words for a long moment. Being someone's anchor. It was what she had wanted to be for Ryan, what she thought she had been. But anchors only work when the other ship isn't trying to sail away. That night, she made a pot of chamomile tea and pulled her resume from an old folder on her desktop. The file was 3 years out of date. She filled in the Gap's weddings shot. Exhibitions featured a brief stint doing product photography for a local boutique. None of it screamed executive assistant material, but she leaned hard on her organizational skills, her ability to juggle multiple deadlines, her discretion with high-profile wedding clients. By midnight, the resume was done. She attached it to a carefully worded cover letter, keeping it professional, almost brisk, as if she wasn't typing it in pajama pants with her cat curled on her feet. Her finger hovered over the send button. If she applied, she was admitting she needed this, admitting that her career as she knew it was on pause, admitting she couldn't do this alone. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. Outside, the faint foghorn of a boat echoed from the harbor. She clicked send. The email vanished into the digital void, leaving behind a strange lightness and an equally strange sense of dread. She closed the laptop and turned off the lights, the apartment sinking into darkness around her. She told herself she'd forget about it in the morning, that she wouldn't sit by the phone waiting. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help wondering who was on the other end of that posting, and what exactly they were looking for. The call came 3 days later, just after Madison had convinced herself she'd never hear back. Miss Clark. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "This is Lauren Parker from Coltech's Human Resources Department. We've reviewed your application for the personal assistant position. Are you available for an interview tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Madison gripped the phone tighter, her heart thudding. Yes, I am. Please bring a printed copy of your resume. Our offices are at Coltech Tower, downtown. Ask for me at the front desk." After they hung up, she sat for a long moment, staring at the sunlight pooling on her kitchen floor. Coltech. She'd heard of them, a tech giant with contracts all over the country. She knew nothing about the CEO. Then again, the posting had made it clear this wasn't about him. It was about the job. The next morning, she dressed in her only tailored blazer, pairing it with a simple blouse and slacks. Sophie had insisted on lending her a structured leather bag to make you look like you know what you're doing, as she put it. Coltech Tower rose sleek and glassy against the Charleston sky, a contrast to the cobblestone streets and pastel facades surrounding it. Inside, the lobby gleamed with white marble, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Madison approached the front desk, where a receptionist with perfect hair and a warmer-than-expected smile handed her a visitor badge. Lauren Parker was waiting early 30s, efficient without being cold. She led Madison to a conference room where another man sat, Mark Jennings, the company's chief operating officer. The questions came steadily. Could she handle complex scheduling? Was she comfortable working with sensitive information? How did she manage stress? Madison answered as honestly as she could, leaning on her experience, juggling demanding clients and time-sensitive projects. Mark nodded toward Lauren. "I think we're aligned. There is one more step. The CEO would like to meet you before we make any decisions. Are you available now?" Madison's pulse skipped. "Yeah, of course." They stepped into the elevator. Lauren made polite small talk about the company's community initiatives, but Madison barely heard her over the hum of the machinery and the pounding of her own heartbeat. The elevator doors opened to a reception area that felt more like a private penthouse than an office. Panoramic views of the harbor, understated art on the walls, the air faintly scented with something expensive and hard to name. Lauren knocked once on a set of tall glass doors, then stepped inside. "Ethan, your candidate is here." The man at the desk had his back to them, speaking into a headset. "No, we can't roll out until the security protocol is airtight. I don't care how fast the market's moving if it's not ready. It's not ready." He ended the call, straightened, and turned. Madison froze. Ethan Cole, the man from the bar. The steady gaze she remembered from that night found her now, sharper but unmistakable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Recognition flickered in his eyes' surprise. Then something she couldn't read before a professional mask settled over his features. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice even, "please, have a seat." She moved to the chair across from him, her knees feeling less reliable than usual. Lauren and Mark took seats to the side, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrent in the room. Ethan opened a folder, her application, and glanced at it briefly. "Your background is unconventional for this role," he began, "but your references speak highly of your reliability and discretion." Madison met his gaze for the briefest second, then looked down at her folded hands. "Thank you. I'm eager to learn whatever the position requires." He asked about her proficiency with certain software, her ability to manage conflicting priorities, whether she could travel on short notice. His tone was all business, but his eyes lingered on hers a fraction longer than necessary each time she answered. When the questions ended, he closed the folder and looked to Lauren and Mark. "Would you give us a moment?" They left, the soft click of the door sealing them in. Ethan leaned back, studying her. "Did you know it was my company when you applied?" Madison shook her head. "I didn't even know your last name." A pause stretched, the hum of the city beyond the glass, the only sound. "That night," she said quietly, "was a mistake." I was hurt. He finished for her. So was I. The truth in his voice caught her off guard. "I need this job," she said finally. "I won't complicate it with anything personal." His expression didn't change, but something softened in his eyes. "Understood." "A beat. You're hired, Miss Clark. Report to Nina Walsh tomorrow morning for training." The interview was over. As Madison left the office, the weight of what had just happened settled over her. She'd gotten the job she desperately needed, but working side by side with the man who had been a stranger one night and something more than that was going to be anything but simple. The first morning in her new role began before the sun had fully risen over Charleston Harbor. Madison stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse for the third time. Her reflection looked calm enough, but her pulse betrayed her quick, unsteady. By 7:45, she was standing in the lobby of Coltech Tower, visitor badge replaced by an employee ID that still felt strange, clipped to her blazer. The elevator ride to the top floor seemed longer than it had during her interview, each floor's soft chime marking another step into unfamiliar territory. Nina Walsh greeted her with a tired but genuine smile. At 8 months pregnant, she moved carefully, one hand often resting against her belly. "You'll do fine," she assured Madison, handing her a neatly organized binder. "Everything you need to know is in here, or at least, everything I think you need to know. Ethan has his own way of doing things." They spent the morning at Nina's desk, which sat just outside Ethan's office, overlooking the panoramic sweep of the harbor. Madison learned the rhythms of the day the way Ethan liked his coffee black. One sugar, delivered at precisely 8:30, the unspoken order in which calls were returned, the subtle hierarchy of who could be put on hold and who never waited. It was more than schedules and emails. There was a quiet current to the way the office worked, a tension Madison could feel but not yet name. People spoke of Ethan with respect, but also with a certain hesitation, as if careful not to disturb whatever balance he kept. Late that morning, she carried a folder into his office. He was standing by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the city's reflection in the glass behind him. "Mr. Cole," she began, keeping her voice steady, "the contract revisions you requested." He glanced at her, and for a moment it was like that night at the bar again, the weight of his attention settling fully on her. "Thank you, Madison." Her name and his voice felt different from anyone else saying it. She set the folder on his desk and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "How are you finding your first day?" She hesitated. A lot to take in, but "I like the view." Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, maybe before he nodded. The view's worth it. By early afternoon, Nina sent her on an errand to the 14th floor to deliver documents. On the way back, Madison caught snippets of conversation from two marketing managers in the hallway. They say he hasn't dated anyone seriously in years. One murmured, "Not since," the other cut in sharply, "Careful. You know how fast things get around." Their voices faded as they moved past her, but the words lingered. That evening, when the rest of the office had emptied, Madison was still at her desk, fine-tuning a schedule for Ethan's upcoming investor meetings. The quiet made the ticking of the clock sound louder. She felt his presence before she saw him. Ethan stood in the doorway, tie loosened, fatigue softening the sharp lines of his expression. "You don't have to stay this late," he said. "I wanted to make sure tomorrow's agenda is exactly how you want it." He stepped closer, glancing at the color-coded calendar on her screen. "Efficient," he said, almost to himself. Then, with a small nod, "Good work." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, not the intense spark of that first night, but a quieter recognition, a shared awareness that neither of them said aloud. The elevator doors closed behind her at 7:15 p., the city lights glittering through the glass as she descended. At home. She set her bag down and leaned against the counter, letting the day replay in her mind. The work was demanding, the pace relentless. But beneath it all, there was a strange steadiness she hadn't felt in months. She didn't yet know what it meant. But the currents under the surface were shifting, and tomorrow, those waters would get more complicated. It began with the sound of high heels on marble, sharp, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of rhythm that announces someone before they ever speak. Madison looked up from her desk just in time to see the elevator doors slide open. The woman who stepped out might as well have walked off the cover of a magazine. Platinum blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, a tailored navy dress that hugged her frame without a wrinkle, and the sort of confidence that made the air feel thinner. "Victoria Hayes," Nina murmured from across the hall, almost under her breath. The name rang a bell. Madison had heard it in passing, usually followed by words like brilliant and relentless. But the way Nina's eyes narrowed told her there was more to the story. Victoria's gaze swept the reception area, pausing just long enough to register Madison before shifting toward Ethan's office. "I'll see myself in," she said to no one in particular, the click of her heels resuming as she crossed the floor. Through the glass wall, Madison watched as Victoria entered without knocking. Ethan looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable, but his posture shifted straighter, more guarded. They spoke for several minutes, their voices muffled but their body language sharp. Madison forced herself to focus on the spreadsheet in front of her, though her eyes kept drifting back to the glass. When the meeting ended, Victoria emerged with the faintest smile, the kind that could be victory or warning. She stopped at Madison's desk. "You must be new," she said, her tone smooth but cool. "Madison Clark," Madison replied, keeping her voice even. Victoria's eyes lingered, assessing. She didn't elaborate, just gave a polite nod and walked away, leaving the scent of expensive perfume in her wake. Later that afternoon, Ethan called Madison into his office. He was standing by the window again, hands in his pockets. "That was Victoria Hayes," he said without preamble. "Her company's been moving aggressively into our market. She came to propose a partnership, or rather, a merger." Madison nodded slowly. "Do you think she means it?" His jaw tightened. With Victoria, there's always a second motive. For the rest of the day, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria's visit was more than business. The way she'd looked at Ethan, not just like a rival CEO, but like someone who had known him far too well. The suspicion was confirmed 2 days later when Madison overheard 2 engineers talking by the coffee machine. They dated for almost 2 years. One said, "It was serious, or at least, it looked that way. Until it wasn't." The other replied, "Nobody really knows why they split, but she's not the kind who forgets." That evening, as Madison packed up her things, she noticed an envelope on her desk. No name, just a single line typed in clean black ink. Some storms don't blow over, they circle back. She stared at it, the hum of the office lights suddenly loud in her ears. Through the glass, she could see Ethan in his office, leaning over a stack of documents. He hadn't noticed her still there. Madison slipped the envelope into her bag, her mind racing. She didn't know what game Victoria was playing or how far she was willing to go, but she had the unsettling sense that whatever it was, she had just been pulled into it, and she wasn't sure Ethan even knew. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of a phone call Madison wasn't meant to overhear. She was sorting through Ethan's morning correspondence when his office door, usually closed during calls, stayed slightly ajar. The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, and sharp enough to slice through the quiet hum of the top floor. "Ethan, this isn't just about pride. It's about survival. Victoria's proposal solves both our liquidity issue and the market share problem." Madison froze, her hand stilling over a stack of envelopes. Richard Cole. She had only seen him once. In a photograph on the wall, Ethan shaking hands with his father at an awards gala. The older man had the same sharp jawline, but none of his son's softness. "I'm not merging with her." Ethan's voice was clipped, deliberate. "This isn't personal," Richard shot back. "It's business. And if you had any sense, you'd realize marrying her would lock in that alliance permanently." Madison's stomach tightened. Marry her. There was a pause, the faint creak of leather, as Ethan shifted in his chair before he replied, "I won't tie my life to someone I can't trust." "You don't have the luxury of choosing trust over profit," Richard snapped. "If you want this company to survive the next 12 months, you'll accept her terms and her, a low, measured breath from Ethan. We're done here." The sharp click of the phone being set down followed, the sound echoing in the stillness. Madison quickly turned back to her desk, eyes fixed on the calendar, pretending the columns of meetings and deadlines could mask the fact that she'd heard every word. When Ethan emerged a minute later, his tie was loosened, his expression a careful blank. Any messages he asked, as though nothing had happened. She handed him a memo from legal and nodded toward his afternoon slot. "Your 2 o'clock with the R&D team confirmed." His fingers brushed hers as he took the paper. The contact lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but she could feel it, the tension wound tight beneath his composed exterior. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of emails, calls, and quiet exchanges. Madison caught herself studying him in the moments between tasks, the way he pinched the bridge of his nose after a long call, the deliberate pauses before he responded to certain emails, the way his jaw set a fraction harder when Victoria's name appeared on a document. By early evening, most of the office had emptied. Madison remained at her desk, finishing the next day's itinerary, though part of her stayed simply to avoid the thought of her quiet apartment. Through the glass wall, she could see Ethan at his desk, leaning back in his chair, one hand covering his eyes. The city's lights shimmered behind him in the window, turning the office into a dim reflection of the harbor at night. Part of her wanted to knock, to step inside and tell him she'd heard the call, to say she understood what it was like to have someone try to steer your life in the name of what's best. Instead, she turned off her monitor, gathered her bag, and offered him a quiet good night as she passed. "Good night." "Madison," he replied, his tone warm but weighed down. In the elevator, she watched the floor numbers descend, her reflection faint in the mirrored walls. She told herself it wasn't her place. She was just his assistant. But on the drive home, the thought refused to let go. Maybe sometimes it was your place, if the person in question had no one else in their corner. That night, Madison sat on her couch with a cup of tea gone cold, the city's hum faint through her open window. Her gaze kept returning to the envelope Victoria had left on her desk days earlier. The words inside "some storms don't blow over." They circle back, felt heavier now. If Victoria was the storm, Richard might be the wind pushing it toward Ethan, whether he wanted it or not. She set the envelope down, her thumb brushing over the edge as if it might reveal more than paper and ink. She didn't know what she could do yet, but she knew she couldn't just stand by and watch the storm roll in. And deep down, she suspected the next wave was already on its way. She stared at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something else. But they didn't. There was no explanation, no context, just the cold certainty of a meeting that promised more than polite conversation. When Ethan emerged from his office late that afternoon, jacket in hand, she asked as casually as she could manage, "Do you want me to prepare any briefing notes for tonight?" He paused just long enough for her to notice, then said, "No, I just want you there." The Lantern was the sort of place people in Charleston talked about in hushed admiration, a rooftop restaurant high above the city, where glass railings gave the illusion that you were floating over the harbor. The terrace glowed under strings of soft lights swaying in the salt breeze. White tablecloths caught the candlelight. Each table a small island of quiet conversation. Madison arrived first, her heart drumming a steady, uneasy rhythm. From their reserved corner table, she could see the sweep of the coastline and the faint glow of ships moving silently across the water. The scent of jasmine drifted from the planters along the edge. She smoothed her dress navy, simple, unassuming, and told herself she was here for work. Victoria arrived in a sheath of emerald silk that seemed to catch every flicker of light. Her hair, the perfect shade of champagne blonde, was swept into a chignon that looked effortless but surely took an hour to achieve. She didn't so much sit as claim her seat, her perfume a crisp blend of citrus and something sharper. Ethan arrived moments later, his presence altering the air. His tie was still knotted, but the top button of his shirt was undone, as if he'd shed just enough formality to signal this wasn't a standard business dinner. "Let's get to the point," he said, sliding into his chair without small talk. Victoria smiled, the slow kind that gave nothing away. Always so direct. "I've missed that." Madison busied herself with the menu, though she'd already memorized it. She could feel Victoria's glance, quick and assessing. The first few minutes stayed on safe ground, quarterly performance numbers, projected trends, mutual industry headaches. But soon, Victoria leaned forward, resting her chin lightly on her hand. "A merger is the logical step," she said, her tone smooth, rehearsed. "Between my AI platform and your security infrastructure, we could own the market within a year, but it requires trust and alignment." Ethan's jaw tightened. Trust doesn't come from a term sheet. Victoria's gaze flicked toward Madison. It comes from knowing the person across the table will put your interests first, like we used to. The air seemed to thin. Madison took a sip of water, letting the coolness steady her. When Ethan didn't respond, Victoria's tone cooled. "Richard understands the value here. He sees what we could accomplish if you'd stop letting personal grudges cloud your judgment." "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice low but sharp. Victoria ignored him, turning fully toward Madison now. "Your assistant has quite the resume for a wedding photographer. Tell me, Madison, do you find the corporate world more exciting than capturing first dances?" It was a surgical strike, meant to undermine. Madison met her gaze evenly. "I find doing meaningful work exciting, whether it's behind a camera or behind a desk." For a flicker of a moment, Victoria's smile faltered before returning. Colder this time. "Careful. Storms have a way of sweeping away things that aren't anchored." Ethan set his wine glass down, the stem making a soft click against the table. "This conversation is over." Victoria's eyes softened, or pretended to. "I'm offering you stability, Ethan. And I don't just mean in business. Think about what happens when the people who say they're in your corner aren't—" Madison felt the words land, but she couldn't tell if they were meant as a warning or a threat. Ethan stood, placing his napkin neatly on the table. "Good night, Victoria." As they walked toward the elevator, Madison could feel the weight of Victoria's gaze following them, a heat between her shoulder blades. Inside the elevator, Ethan exhaled slowly, looking straight ahead. She's not going to stop. Madison's voice was quiet, but certain. Then, neither should we. The elevator doors slid open to the hushed lobby. Outside, the night air was cooler, the scent of the harbor stronger here. But as they stepped into the shadows, Madison knew the dinner hadn't been the fight. It had been the opening move, and the real confrontation was still to come. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning. Madison arrived at Coltech to find the top floor buzzing, people speaking in low voices, darting in and out of offices with papers clutched in their hands. Nina, who had come in briefly to finalize her leave, pulled Madison aside. "Victoria's company just filed an acquisition bid," she whispered. "Hostile takeover. She's going after Coltech." It explained the tension in the air, the tightness in everyone's movements. Madison's mind raced. This wasn't just about business. This was about everything Ethan had built, and about the man she'd come to know beneath the armor. By noon, Ethan called her into his office. His tie was loose, the lines around his eyes deeper than she'd ever seen. "She's got leverage," he said, handing her a folder. "Confidential reports, investor lists, security protocols, things that should never have left this building." Madison flipped through the pages, her chest tightening. "How did she get these, I think?" Ethan hesitated. "I think someone inside helped her, and if we can prove it, we can stop this." The weight of the folder in her hands felt like more than paper. It was a choice. She could stay quiet and let the attorneys handle it, or she could step into the storm with him. "I'll help," she said simply. For 2 days, they worked side by side, chasing digital trails, combing through access logs, piecing together timelines. Madison's attention to detail, the same skill that had once made her a great photographer, became their weapon. On the third evening, she founded a pattern of logins from a remote server tied to Victoria's CTO, timed perfectly with investor leaks. They had proof. That night, Ethan called for a board meeting. The conference room was tense, every seat filled. Victoria strode in with her attorney, confidence radiating from every step. "You can fight me," she told the board, "or you can join me. Either way, Coltech is coming under my control." Ethan didn't rise to the bait. He simply slid Madison's compiled evidence across the table. "We can also report you for corporate espionage, which carries both civil and criminal penalties. Your choice, Victoria." For the first time, her composure faltered. Her attorney glanced at the documents, his jaw tightening. "We'll need a moment." They left the room. When they returned 10 minutes later, Victoria's gaze was sharp but colder now, the kind of cold that comes when a battle is lost. "You've made an enemy, Ethan," she said. Then, with a pointed glance at Madison, "Both of you have." She walked out without another word. The room was silent for a beat before the board chair cleared his throat. "Well done, Mr. Cole and Miss Clark." By the time the meeting ended, it was after 9. The office was dark except for the glow from Ethan's window. Madison found him there, looking out over the harbor. "You saved my company," he said quietly. "You fought for it." She replied, "I just didn't let you fight alone." He turned toward her, something unguarded in his expression now. "My father wanted me to marry her for the business. He couldn't understand that I'd rather lose everything than tie my life to someone I don't trust or love." Madison's breath caught. "And what about tying your life to someone you do?" he asked. The question hung in the air, not desperate, not rushed, just real. Her mind flashed through everything: the night at the bar, the mornings in the office, the quiet moments of understanding, the storms they'd weathered together. She realized that somewhere along the way, her heart had already chosen. "Yes," she said simply. Ethan stepped closer, taking her hands. "Then I think it's time we start building something together. Not just for the company, for us." 2 months later, Madison stood on the rooftop terrace of the Lantern again, but this time the air was softer, the evening warmer. Strings of lights swayed gently above, the harbor below catching the last gold of sunset. Ethan knelt in front of her, a small velvet box in his hand. "The night I met you, I thought I was watching someone run away from her life. Now I know you were running toward the life you deserved. I just hope I get to spend the rest of mine making sure you never have to run again." Her yes came through tears and laughter, the kind that felt like sunlight breaking through after a long storm. Sophie was there, grinning, and even Richard, after months of seeing Madison's loyalty and skill, offered a nod of genuine respect. Nina, holding her newborn, teased Ethan about finally having someone to keep him in line. On their wedding day, Charleston bloomed with spring. The ceremony was small, close friends, family, and the harbor breeze carrying the scent of salt and magnolia. Madison wore a simple gown, her bouquet tied with a ribbon from the dress she'd left behind on Folly Beach. As they exchanged vows, there were no doubts, no shadows, only the quiet certainty that they had both been through the fire and come out stronger. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for walking into that bar." Madison smiled through happy tears. "Thank you for walking toward me." They stepped forward together into the applause, into the warmth of the afternoon, into the life they had chosen. And for the first time in a long time, Madison felt entirely at home, not in a place, but in a person. Life has a way of testing us in the most unexpected moments. Madison's journey reminds us that sometimes what feels like the end is only the beginning of something far better. She walked away from a future that looked perfect on the outside, but was built on lies, and in doing so, opened the door to a love that was honest, steady, and true. Ethan's story shows that success and wealth mean little without someone to share them with, and that trust, once found, is worth protecting at all costs. For those of us who have lived long enough to see dreams change shape, this story is a gentle reminder it is never too late to start over. We may lose people, plans, or even parts of ourselves, but we do not lose the ability to choose what comes next. True happiness is built not on avoiding pain, but on finding the courage to grow through it and to let others walk beside us in that journey. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as loss, and the bravest thing we can do is to keep our hearts open when life gives us a second chance. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. Your support means the world to us. If Madison and Ethan's journey touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who might need its message, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. Every like, share, and subscription helps us keep bringing you moments that inspire, heal, and connect us all.